America, huh? The greatest nation the world has ever seen, the pioneer for the free world, and the poster child for democracy and free speech. Well, that's what it is now. History, however, paints the star-spangled flag with a much darker shade of red. The truth is that the history of America is filled with violence and oppression, and few people had to face the horrors of early America like the Native Americans. Join us as we take a look at the worst things that happened during the Native American incident, also known as the Wounded Knee incident. So, the Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890 was a pretty tragic event. Basically, US soldiers and a group of Lakota Sioux clashed near Wounded Knee Creek in South Dakota. The US government wanted to disarm the Lakota Sioux, and there was a lot of tension between them due to cultural differences and historical conflicts. The Lakota Sioux, led by Chief Bigfoot, had surrounded the US troops because they were tired and wanted safety. But things went south when a shot was fired during the disarmament attempt. It turned into a chaotic situation, with the US soldiers using excessive force, including machine guns, against the mostly unarmed Lakota Sioux, including women and kids. The result was a brutal massacre and a devastating loss of life. It's important to remember that this wasn't just about that specific moment. It's part of a broader context of US government policies that have been pretty tough on indigenous communities. These policies included things like taking their land, trying to make them assimilate, and generally eroding their cultures and traditions. There were a number of horrifying aspects to this massacre, all of which left a scar on the Native Americans for a long time. It was a real tragedy that went down on that day, back in 1890, near Wounded Knee Creek on the Lakota Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota. In a heartbreaking show of violence, an estimated 150 to 300 Lakota Sioux lost their lives. What makes it even worse is that a lot of them weren't even armed. These people didn't pose any immediate threat to the US soldiers who were circling around them, but they fired anyway. Families were torn apart and dreams shattered in an instant. It's tough to imagine the pain and suffering that remained for generations because of what happened at Wounded Knee. Just imagine the scene, a camp where people should have felt safe turning into a battlefield in the blink of an eye. The sound of gunfire piercing the air, but completely one-sided. You've got the US Army with their superior weapons up against a community that had been oppressed and pushed to the brink. The Lakota Sioux were fighting to preserve their culture, their whole way of life, and their right to exist on the lands that had been theirs for generations. We can't just look at these lost lives as mere numbers. They were part of a vibrant culture with stories, traditions, and a deep connection to the land. Think about the families torn apart, leaving behind loved ones who'd be carrying this heavy burden of tragedy for years and years. It's a devastating part of our history, and it's a dark reminder of the importance of understanding, empathy, and justice for all. Imagine you've got a peaceful encampment of Native Americans, families hanging out together, and all of a sudden, bam! The whole scene gets shattered by these rapid-fire Hotchkiss machine guns, courtesy of the US Army. Horrifying, isn't it? Especially when you consider this community had already been dealing with a boatload of injustice. So here's the deal. Those US soldiers had the upper hand, armed to the teeth with those powerful machine guns. They surrounded the camp, and they attacked mercilessly. The bullets tore through the air, finding targets left and right without a second thought. And here's the worst part. Among those targets were innocent civilians. Not warriors, just regular folks trying to keep their families safe and maintain their way of life. This wasn't some targeted attack on specific combatants. It was a brutal assault on a whole community. The result was a massive loss of life that left a deep scar in the memory of the Lakota Sioux that still lingers on. And let's not forget, there were women and children caught up in this nightmare, adding a heartbreaking layer to the whole mess. Families torn apart, parents and siblings left grieving. It was a scene of pure grief and pain that echoes through generations. After all the chaos of that gunfire, you can imagine how miserable it must have been. It was a total mess, and the survivors, a lot of them Lakota Sioux, were dealing with some heavy injuries. We're talking unimaginable pain, both physically and emotionally. Their bodies were covered with the scars of the violence they just faced. To make things worse, it's December and it's freezing cold. The wounded are stuck in a really tough spot. The US soldiers moved on, leaving the camp destroyed. Some of these survivors were just lying in the snow, helpless and in desperate need of medical attention. But guess what? That help never showed up. Without proper treatment, their chances of surviving were slim to none, and that unforgiving cold weather, hypothermia, and exposure became threats to those already weakened by their wounds. Tragically, some of the wounded, because of the lack of medical care, end up not making it. Their injuries left untreated in those brutal winter conditions led to their death. The physical suffering the wounded faced, the emotional pain their loved ones went through, and the avoidable loss of life because of the absence of medical assistance are a reminder that empathy and humanity are the most important things, especially during times of crisis. What happened after the Wounded Knee Massacre was just heartbreaking. It wasn't just the tragic loss of life, it was how the bodies of those Lakota Sioux who died were treated. It's actually tough to stomach. The fallen bodies of the Lakota Sioux were just left out in the cold, exposed, abandoned to the elements. The scene was chilling, both literally and figuratively. Those freezing temperatures had a grip on those bodies, and many were frozen into these weird, grotesque positions like they were frozen in time, stuck in the moment when all that violence went down. But what's disturbing is not just the physical suffering they faced in life, it's about the lack of empathy and the total disregard for their humanity even in death. It's a painful reminder of the disrespect shown to a community that had already been through so much. They were denied the most basic of dignity and respect that every single human being deserves, even in their final moments. So you know that land where the Wounded Knee Massacre happened? Even though the US soldiers showed up and mercilessly turned it into a battlefield, it was so much more than that to the Lakota Sioux. It had deep cultural and spiritual importance. What went down that day was more than just a loss of life. It messed up a whole way of living and really affected the Lakota's precious cultural practices and traditions. For the Lakota Sioux, that area near Wounded Knee Creek wasn't just a regular spot. It was like woven into their identity, part of their core. It's where they told stories, held ceremonies, and passed on their heritage from one generation to the next. That land was sacred, holding the memories and spiritual legacy of the Lakota people. But then the massacre happened, and it completely wrecked this sacred connection. The violence against the Lakota community threw a big wrench into their ability to keep up with their cultural traditions and pass them down. It was a major hit to their sense of who they were, and that loss still hurts them even today. Try to imagine what it's like when a place that's loaded with your history gets destroyed by senseless brutality like that. It's not just a physical scar, it's a spiritual wound that cuts right into the soul of a whole community. It made the Lakota feel even more marginalized, taking away their chance to practice ceremonies, share their stories, and keep their traditions going that have been their backbone for generations. Losing those cultural practices, it's like erasing a part of their identity, and that's a big deal. It's not just about what the Lakota Sioux went through that day, it's about their descendants and all of us understanding their culture better. The takeaway here is how darn important it is to acknowledge and respect the cultural heritage of indigenous communities. We need to value their stories, traditions, and the special places that mean so much to them. As the smoke cleared and those US soldiers moved on, the survivors were left to face a painful reality. Many of them had lost family members, parents, siblings, spouses, and even children to the senseless violence. Families were torn apart, leaving behind a void that could never be truly filled. But it wasn't just the emotional turmoil that they had to deal with. These Lakota Sioux who survived the massacre were then kicked off their ancestral lands. Not only were their friends and family killed, but they also had to run away and relocate and start their life somewhere else. They had to start over, find new places to call home, and deal with a world that had shown them so much cruelty. The trauma of being uprooted from the land that held their history and spiritual connection was just another heavy burden they had to bear. And the suffering didn't stop there. These survivors often found themselves in a hostile environment, marginalized and mistreated by a broader society that, at times, just failed to acknowledge the immense loss they had endured. They were left carrying the weight of their grief, while trying to fit into a world that had proven itself to be unjust. The emotional scars on the women and children who had witnessed that violence at Wounded Knee, unbelievable. The trauma they went through didn't end on that single day. It became a part of their lives, shaping how they saw things, affecting their mental and emotional well-being, and even influencing how they interacted with others. The hardships faced by these survivors were all-encompassing. It wasn't just about finding shelter, food, and security. It was also about dealing with the psychological toll of living in the aftermath of such a brutal event. Imagine trying to navigate a society that didn't recognize your pain, that didn't acknowledge the injustices that you have suffered. It's a nightmare. But for the Lakota Sioux, it was their reality. But here's the incredible part. Despite all the unimaginable hardships, many of these survivors found ways to keep going, hold on to their cultural heritage, and pass down their stories to future generations. Their strength in the face of adversity is a shining example of just how darn tough the Lakota Sioux are, showing that even in the darkest of times, people can find a way to keep their heritage alive. As we think back on the Wounded Knee Massacre, it's important to honor the memory of those who lost their lives. We've got to make sure their stories are shared, not as some far-off history lesson, but as a reminder of the injustice and suffering that Native American communities endured. That loss of life at Wounded Knee is a painful chapter in our history, and a reminder of the consequences of violence. What was your biggest takeaway from the Native American incident? Let us know in the comments. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time.